Hello, everyone. This is Bill Hull. My friends and I are together on what we're calling Bonhoeffer Backstage today, and for 90 scintillating minutes that you'll be on the edge of your seats as you listen to us and the wisdom we have. It's unbelievable. I mean, I can hardly believe I have the smartest people in Christendom right here with me today. And it reminds me of smart people. Dallas Willard, the great Christian philosopher, he said that the real challenge of the church is to get the church out of the church so it can be the church. And when I was a pastor, that was the challenge that I thought was my greatest challenge, was to convince people that what they did Monday through Saturday was of equal importance to what they did on Sunday when they arrived at the church, maybe even more so. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said that the church is only the church when it exists for others. William Temple, at one time the Archbishop of Canterbury, said the church is at its best when its purpose is the welfare of its non-members. So you're catching a theme there from some very wise individuals. And the idea is that when we get out of beyond ourselves and out of ourselves into other people's lives, that's when we really excel. That's when we soar. This is what we're thinking about as we are in 2020, because getting out of the church so that we can be the church has been imposed upon us by an international, worldwide pandemic. And there's a lot to be learned and have learned. And that's what we want to do today, is I want to talk with my panel about what we've learned in 3 areas during 2020. The first is on the personal level. The second, the pastoral level. Third, the church level. And we're going to talk together for about 45 minutes. We're going to take a little look at the Bonhoeffer Project for like 10 minutes. And then we're going to get into questions and answers, and that'll take up our 90 minutes today. So we hope that, I'll promise you this, that you'll hear something today that will help you, that will motivate you, or even make you mad and want you to prove us wrong, that it'll create some action points. Now, the people that I have with me today are all lead pastors. The first is Brandon Cook, who is the co-founder, along with myself, of the Bonhoeffer Project. He has been recently released after 11 years of pastoring. He's been released on his good behavior and a good resume and a promise to do better in the future. He has been living in California for a very long time now. That's where his church was, in Long Beach, California. He is now moving to North Carolina. It seems like that's kind of in the air here in California right now, people leaving it. And Brandon said he'd rather be in a very memorable line, surrounded by, instead of 2 million people, 2 million trees. And so he's going to North Carolina in the backwoods somewhere where he can be, get in touch with who he really is. But actually, Brandon is a very creative spirit. He and I worked together to develop the Bonhoeffer Project. He was great on the creative side and the writing side. We've done some books together. And so it's great to have Brandon with us today. He can tell us a little bit more about himself autobiographically as we talk. The second person we have with us is Stephen Kimbrell. Stephen is an interesting little factoid here, is that anybody who lives in California is not really from California. So Brandon Cook is actually from Alabama. Now, Stephen Kimbrell, who is the lead pastor of Grace City Church in Irvine, California, is not some upscale, sensitive guy from Southern California. Actually, he's from Alabama too.
That's right.
So we got a couple of Bubbas here. So Stephen is this church. Stephen started from scratch several years ago, and he's been a leader in the Bonhoeffer Project now. He's on our national leadership team and a good friend. The third person we have is Dan Lights. Dan Lights, where are you actually from, Dan?
I'm actually from here. So
okay, you're actually from
I'm the one that was the fly in the ointment here. So I messed that up. Sorry.
That's all right. We let one in.
Thank you. Much
Dan is the lead pastor of Calvary Chapel. You may have heard of Calvary Chapels. He is lead pastor of Calvary Chapel in Oceanside, which sounds like tough duty.
It is. It's suffering for the Lord here in Oceanside. Absolutely.
Yeah. And Dan has recently finished one of our cohorts, and I think he's going to be partnering with us in the future. And so Dan is a very insightful guy, a lot of energy, and a good sense of humor. Before we go on, show us your Pope hat, just to make the happen, okay?
Yeah, just in case people wonder, I've got my Pope hat. Oh, yeah. And I dropped stuff.
Sorry about that.
That's my Bonhoeffer project finishing.
Oh, you shouldn't have shown that. That's
so sorry.
That's
I'm sorry.
Secret. Yeah.
Here's my Pope hat, though. This is for when people think I'm getting a little too religious on them. They'll point to the Pope hat.
Now, normally, guys, we would have the chips and the dip, right?
It's true.
And all that, but unfortunately today, it's bring your own food. All right. So what we want to do is we want to start talking about this. And so, Dan, I'm going to ask you the first question.
Sure.
What's been your, on a personal level, general impression of 2020? And you're not allowed to swear because you're a pastor. So what we want you to do is tell us a bit about 2020 and what, on the personal side, what are some of the things you've learned and that God has taught you?
There's been peaks and valleys. I think going all the way back to early 2020, I remember all the different camps and all the different, just the media that you get through the email. And everybody was like, vision for 2020. Everybody had this kind of vision thing, 2020 vision. And man, I was hoping that some of them would be a little more prophetic because they didn't give us any clue as to what was going to happen in 2020. It's been a roller coaster, to be honest with you, not just as a pastor, but obviously as a parent. I've got 4 young kids, 13 to 5. We homeschool, so that actually didn't change all that much with the whole COVID thing. That's been a saving grace. But I mean, just in the personal level of getting to know one another a little more, not having all the access to all the accoutrement outside of the doors and the walls of the house, getting to know one another. And then, for I would say just even personally being able to be and try to be creative in getting fellowship, because I think it's one of the things. I'm an introvert by nature. And I know it wouldn't seem that way, but I get my my steam by just being quiet, working on some projects at home. That's just where I get kind of my joy from. But I didn't realize, I think personally as much until this year, how much I need people, how much people are a part of and really integral in our relationships with the Lord, our fellowship with the saints. It's super important that we have those relationships. So I learned, thinking, because I even talked to my congregation much about how some of you introverts were kind of glad that there was COVID, because you got an excuse to stay at home and not do anything with anyone and watch movies all day by yourself. But I think for those of us who recognize that fellowship's a big part of just being a disciple of Jesus and being in fellowship with one another, it was definitely missing very apparently from my life. So, and then, I think it was probably around July, after, kind of navigating all this for a while, that I finally was blessed with the Rona. I finally got the dreaded coronavirus, which I got from a brother here in the church who had no clue that he had it. Still doesn't think he had it and still didn't think he'd give it to me, but that's a whole nother conversation and a different time. Yeah. But ended up having it, gave it to my wife. We shared it with our children. So our whole family got it. It was a It wasn't as tough, for us. Again, my heart goes out to those who experienced quite a different experience than we did. But it actually, even in that, there was a lot of freedom. People even ask me, "Hey, you going to get the vaccine?" I said, "I already had the natural one, so I'm good. I'm safe on that one." And so it's been eye-opening, just personally, for the fellowship aspect of it. And then, of course, the pastoral aspect is a whole nother game, but it's caused us to really focus on what's important in our lives.
Okay, well, how about you, Stephen?
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and I think, if I could summarize it in one word, it would be off script. It's just been a year that's off script. I think about, how many of us had huge plans for 2020. I saw, so many churches, your best year yet, 2020.
Yeah, I think that stuff, just tear it up and throw it away. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. All those things. And I don't think it's wrong to have plans as a church or wrong to have plans, as an individual. I think that's great. I think that's how God wired us. But I think this year we're getting a firsthand reminder that, ultimately we're not in control. And the verse that's continued to come to my mind all year, I hate to get spiritual on us, but Proverbs 16:9 says, "The heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps." And I think, we all know that in theory, right? But we really, sometimes we tend to think that we have a sense of control in our life, in our little world. And so I think all of this year, we've been through this crash course of understanding that we really are not the ultimate authority on our lives in the world. We're not the king. Jesus is. And sometimes his plans take us off script. And I think, we've just learned a lot about living off script this year. For a lot of us, that causes anxiety, that causes stress. But then, there are a lot of great things that come when our lives go off script. I think we'll look back on 2020 as a family and think that, yeah, there was some craziness, but I think some of our best memories as a family will come because of trips that we took during this year, because we wouldn't have taken those and different things. And so, it was off script. Some of it was crazy and some of it's great memories, but that's how I would summarize it.
Okay, so you had your house almost burned down and you were displaced for a while. That was and that happened kind of the same time you had a kidney stone and a few other things. So you had a kind of really a compressed time of tension there, and talk about off script, capitalized.
Yeah, a lot of off script things inside the pandemic. So it was kind of crazy there for a while.
Well, Brandon, what about you on a personal level?
Well, apart from the pandemic, for me, this year has been the most transition. I mean, I transitioned out of being a pastor. We're in the midst of preparing to move out of California. So it's been a huge year of transition, of dreaming for the future. Like Dan, sort of seeing some silver linings, time with our family. That's been really sweet. But to pick up off of the theme of anxiety that Stephen introduced, on a personal level, I've been reflecting pretty intensely on the anxiety in our society and in our culture, which I think was revealed in part by the election. But this year, I've had conversations all throughout the year with people, apart from the pandemic, people who just said, I've never seen the polarization, the anxiety levels be as high as they are. Now, one person memorably said to me, it used to be, I'm right, you're wrong. Now it's, I'm right, you're evil. Just this deeply entrenched level of anxiety, polarization. And on a personal level, trying to figure out how to navigate life well in the midst of a society that is often seemingly devouring itself. So some personal transition, and then a lot of thinking about the culture around us and how to navigate it well.
That leads me to reflect a bit myself on this issue of anxiety. I find that the pressure, there's just sort of the low grade pressure on people, like stress on a bridge, it reveals the cracks in our persons. And I've seen it with my own wife and family. I've seen it with my adult children and their children. I've seen it with so many different people, but the way in which this stress continues to play upon us, and we don't see the end in sight. And particularly in some areas where the COVID has become such a strong force, and the fear that has been engendered in it, instead of just respecting it, become fearful. And so I think there's been some of that as well. I think what I've really missed is just being with people, the freedom to be with my friends, to go where I wanted to, when I want to, even church. My church is just across the street, but I haven't really had much of interaction with people in months. And I've mastered recluse, but I really don't like it. I don't like being a recluse. And I'm already making plans, and I'm trying to figure out when the plan is. And I have anxiety about the fact that I don't know when exactly I should get on an airplane again, or when we can even have a conference or get together with people, things like that. It just kind of wears on you. And you realize that now, if you're just sort of a quart low on certain endorphins or something else that medical science talks about. But anyway, okay, I think the personal level, we've all felt it. Now, what about the pastoral level? And what I mean here is, what have you discovered about yourself in pastoring as a leader? And then what have you discovered about the people you're pastoring?
I would say, going off of what Brandon was saying, he touched on it, the polarization. When you're in the midst of a season, a year like we are, the polarization becomes more apparent. I've seen that. Again, we're used to ministering to, in the wide funnel, if you will, the multitudes ministry. You're ministering to non-believers all the way to seasoned disciples of Christ. Now there's another layer of that, where you're seeing not just those, from one side to the other, but you're seeing the polarizing in the political realm, in the COVID realm. And so now you're ministering on a whole different level, where there's now people at one another based upon their view of things that aren't even scripture, things that aren't even in the Bible, just personalities and proclivities and just tendencies. And those are, rising to the forefront. And then you even see churches around us that have kind of grasped onto those things and taken one side or the other, the make church great again crowd, and kind of moving into that realm. And then the antis and it's opened my eyes to see how broken we all are, and even more so the need for Christ, and the more so the need that people have to be focused on kingdom principles rather than the principles in this world.
Yeah, you might have discovered that people aren't as rational as we think we are.
Well, it's like what Brandon said, it used to be, I'm right and you're wrong. Now it's I'm right and you're evil. And that has been playing out, I think, tangibly we see it face to face, but you see it all over social media. You see it in the just everywhere, right and left. Doesn't matter. It's kind of permeated the culture.
What about you, Stephen?
Yeah, I think one thing I found out this year personally, and then as I talk to other pastors, I feel like the same thing is true. A lot of pastors have been really, really tired this year. And I don't think that's just a pastor thing. I think that's a leader thing. There's been so much adversity to lead through this year. I was listening to a podcast from Ray Johnston, who pastors at Bayside Church in Northern California, a couple weeks ago. And one of the analogies he gave really hit home with me. He said a pastor always has, you have your support level, and then you have your challenges. Okay, your support level and your challenges. And your support, that's your people, that's your staff, that's your leadership team. They're the people that God has surrounded you with, that you're leading, that you're shepherding, and that you have this vision that you're going after with. And then you have your challenges of what you feel God's called you to do. And as leaders, we're trying to call, our challenges are a little above our support level. So we're always trying to call our support level up. But what Ray Johnson said is during this pandemic and during this whole year, we've seen our support level drop and our challenges increase. And so that gap between the two, we're trying to make up as pastors, because our challenges are the pandemic, racial tensions, rioting, wildfires here in California, this political season where a lot of us felt like we weren't pastoring so much as just playing referee all the time. And I think between all of that activity, that gap between our support and our challenges, I know I've felt it this year more than any other year. And the other pastors I've reached out to and said, how you doing? That's kind of been the common thread, is a lot of guys that said, you know what, I'm hanging in there, but I'm just tired. I feel like I'm using up a lot of energy. So yeah, I think that's something that I've really seen go on in my life this year. I don't know about you guys.
Brandon.
Well, I got out not a moment too soon.
You're kind of a slithery kind of bean, aren't you?
Yeah, I had some sort of sixth sense, I guess. I stopped pastoring technically in April, but I was essentially done with my duties on good terms, I might add, in March, and then COVID hit. And one of my reflections as I ceased being a pastor, which I really loved being a pastor, I'm really glad I'm not doing it anymore, because one of my reflections was just, this is a crazy tough job. And part of that reflection was, it's a tough job because we live in a deeply consumeristic society, which I knew that intellectually. Yeah, we live in a consumer society, but I think stepping away from it helped me realize just how it's almost the emperor has no clothes. We don't even see how consumeristic our society is, and how that bleeds into the church, where, oh, you don't like this, we'll just go to another church. You don't like this, someone rubbed you the wrong way, well, there's always another option, which is not the way that it was in the first century context, where you had to really develop your character to hang in with a community of people. So I think we're it's just a tough gig being a pastor. We know that based on the pastoral burnout rates, we probably know the stats, but we also probably know some anecdotal evidence. And I think the polarization is actually a sign of our consumerism, that people are so focused on their rightness, and their rights, that I think the polarization and the consumerism go hand in hand. So the question for me is, I'm no longer vocationally a pastor, but I still consider myself a pastor. How then do I call people into a life that cuts against the grain of that consumerism, and bring so that people can have awareness of, I want to have a Christ-formed life, not a life that is so focused on my rights or my rightness. So that continues for me as a pastor to be one of my main focuses. How do we form lives that cut against the message of the empire, so that people can live lives formed by the kingdom? And that's a great, I don't have the answer, but that's a lifelong wrestling I know that I'll be in.
How many, and anybody can answer this one, what about, have you ever felt like you're just sort of out of ammo, like you got a gun in your hand, but there's no bullets, that you don't have anything, you're out of bullets? And then what starts breaking down? Or do you know anybody that's going through that, or people you work with? And all of you have been in, leading cohorts now and so on. What are you learning about the people that you're helping along these days?
Do you mean leaders or just?
Yeah, leaders. Yeah, I think that pastoral leaders in general, ministry leaders.
Well, I think I know what you're asking. I think COVID-19 and the whole 2020 year has caused pastors to feel like we kind of have to shoot every bullet we have, right? And then some we didn't know we had. I don't think seminary prepared any of us for this, and I think that's why a lot of pastors feel exhausted. It's because You guys have probably heard the analogy this year that you feel like, you signed up to run a marathon and then you get to the finish line and they say, oh no, this is triathlon. You still gotta, bike, and you still gotta swim. And a little bit just with the changes that have come this year, it seems like once you get over one hurdle, then there's another hurdle that's right behind it. And so, yeah, I think we've had to shoot a lot of bullets. I think a lot of guys are tired from that. I know for me personally, having a community of pastors, even though it hasn't been that much in-person fellowship, kind of a Zoom fellowship with other guys saying, you know what, I've been in that same boat, has been an encouragement to me.
What is it? What do you do when you feel stuck or out of energy or even depressed? What do you do?
I cry. I just cry.
Yeah. Well, that's okay.
Fine.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Put on the Pope hat.
Yeah. Feel better about myself. Pop on the Pope hat.
Okay, that's
what I would say is, again, this is where I advocate for, in many ways, team leaderships. It's not that I don't believe there should be a buck stops here, but as senior leaders, we have to understand that there's an end to ourselves. We have to understand that God has not called us to have the entire weight of the fellowship on our shoulders. I don't think that's how he determined to do it. His yoke is easy, his burden is light. I'm not going to pack the entire church onto my shoulders and say, let's go. There are times where I need to be on Jesus's shoulders. I need to let go. I need to let these things down. And that's where I advocate. I am grateful. I am blessed. I have so many guys on my team who I can go to and say, man, I am sick of the changing COVID restrictions. We just get one thing set up and now it's all decimated this next week. We get one thing going. We just had it. We just went into the purples here. A couple of weeks ago, we had everything clicking, children's ministries, student ministries, everything was going, boom, shut down. And now it all has to change. And I get exasperated. I'm like, I'm about ready to just throw in the towel and not quit, but just start, advocating again, as Brandon was talking about, for my rights, start becoming more American than I am Christian. And what that ends up doing is it reflects more of the culture than it does Christ. And so I'll end up kind of disqualifying or discrediting my own self through my own actions. So I'm just grateful that I have many leaders, yourselves included, that I can bounce stuff off of or say, man, I'm hurting right now. I am done with this. And so I need people to talk sense into me because, I always say my first reaction is never usually a godly one. My first reaction is usually one that I need to repent for. So that's where I hold on, I wait, I pray, I seek godly counsel. And I'm glad I have it. I'm glad we have one another. I'm glad, even for the Bonhoeffer Project, for discipleship.org, to come together as like-minded and say, man, what a year, right? How you struggling? How you doing? Even Stephen and I have talked, and just even through COVID and things like that. It's just been wonderful to have.
okay. I think he froze. Who's unfrozen?
I'm unfrozen. I thought it was me.
No, actually. Okay.
This is perfect. This is 2020. It would be a shame if it didn't show up on this call.
Dan will come back eventually. I'm sure he'll come back eventually. Okay, so why don't we move on to like what we've been doing in the church? Like, for example, the first thing that happens, it seems like, is that everybody has to get accustomed to less numbers. Fewer people, not as many people to speak to hear from, to have together to affirm one another. So what, Stephen, let's go with you on this one to begin with. What have you learned about making disciples in your church in 2020 that you didn't know when 2020 began, before the pandemic?
Yeah. Well, I think, I think we've all learned that we really had an addiction to numbers, especially crowds. Even if we, tried to, say we didn't, we all, I think as pastors, it's so difficult to not gauge your success by how many people were there on Sunday. Maybe not even necessarily the number that's there, but whether that's an increase from the previous week or whether you're an increase from last year. I think that's such a difficult thing. And so I think one of the good things that this has forced us to do is it's really ripped that idol away from us, because, I know there's the unicorn church out there that's having more people now than they did before. But by and large, I think from what I'm hearing, most churches are in anywhere from 30% to 60% return rate still. And so we've been forced to forsake that idol, at least. I think God's trying to help us with that, and to really focus on, okay, how are we still going about the mission of making disciples that make disciples? And I think, the one thing that stands out to me that we've learned about disciple making during this period is, I think the pandemic's further clarified that relational discipleship works. As I look at our church, and I look at the people who are still, I consider going strong and doing well in their Christian walk, are those who were deeply connected into discipleship relationships, whether that was through a small group or what we call our mentoring groups, or just, maybe a small group of individuals who got together. But I think those are the ones that we're seeing continue to thrive. And then those that were not connected deeply in relational discipleship, either by discipling others or being discipled themselves, I think those are the ones that we have seen struggle. And so I would say that that's something I felt like we knew going in, that relational discipleship worked. But I think coming through this, we're seeing that it still continues to work even during a pandemic, because it's so much more fluid and moldable. The other thing I would say with discipleship that we've learned is that I think you really have to have, in the church context, I think you have to have a multi-layered approach to what I call kind of your structural side of discipleship. I know we all organically want our churches making disciples, but when it comes to the structural side, I think it needs to be multi-layered, multifaceted. And what I mean by that is that it can't just be, well, this is our one silver bullet for discipleship, and just join this program, join this group even, and you'll make disciples. For instance, in our church, we have small groups, and that's a big part of our disciple making in our church. But then we also have something that we call mentoring groups, which is kind of like smaller groups. They're gender specific, and they're a little more intense than what our small groups would be. And we've seen through the pandemic, I would say our small groups have done okay. I think
You have more or less?
We have less. We saw a slight bump in the beginning when Zoom was kind of a novelty. Remember that?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And then I think as Zoom kind of wore on, or the pandemic wore on, people got tired of Zoom. I think most of our groups can't meet in person because A, we're in California, and B, we have a lot of kids in our groups, a lot of families, and it just wouldn't work with people going to people's houses. But what has worked during this time, what has grown deeper, and what we've seen people really be changed through is our mentoring groups, which again are smaller and gender-based. And I'm not saying those are the way to go, but what I am saying is I'm glad we had, at least in that aspect, a multi-layered approach, so that all of our kind of discipleship eggs weren't in one basket, if that makes sense.
Because I've heard some pastors say that they've rediscovered church by that they had 3 groups, now they got 16 groups. And because that's the only option they have, they can't really meet in any kind of number, so that they've rediscovered so many things. I just saw that the other day, some pastor talking about that. It wasn't a large church, it was a medium or even smaller church, but he had seen that. Brandon, what do you have to offer on this? How could you help us?
Well, I appreciated Stephen's transparency about the numbers, and it reminded me of the quote I first heard from you, Bill, from Eugene Peterson. There's 3 ways that people try to find transcendence apart from God: the recreational sex, recreational alcohol and drugs, and the ecstasy of crowds. And that again is part of our culture, is that if we have large crowds, we're successful, whether we're fruitful or not. Obviously, I'm not directly involved in pastoring a church right now, but what I've heard from a number of my friends is part of the challenge is they don't know who's really there. It raises this question: who is the crowd? What is the crowd? How do we know who's showing up on? They don't have a way to know who's showing up on Zoom, and so it raises this question: what are the bonds that hold our community together apart from Zoom attendance, Sunday morning attendance? And to Stephen's point, how do we disciple people apart from that sort of, from being on a Zoom call? I think it gets, again, it throws me into the question: how do we create disciples who think about church as something that we are rather than something we go to? Because going to a Zoom call doesn't make you a disciple. And it gets into the question of, well, what are the bonds that hold a community together? Do we have allegiance to one another as a community beyond the fact that we go when it's convenient? When it's not COVID time, we go because it's convenient. Do we have bonds to each other, to faithfulness towards our community, to allegiance towards one another, even when there's disagreement? What kind of, are we making disciples who actually know how to be a community of church when church isn't easy? And I think for the pastors that I've spoken to, that's a real question right now. Now that church is not easy, what are the bonds that hold us together?
Yeah, that's good. That's good. What, Dan, welcome back.
Sorry, no, complete network failure. Super awesome. Love.
Yeah, right into the penalty
I
box.
need a tech guy. If anybody's got a tech guy out there, it needs a job. I'm just kidding.
Hey, by the way, okay, now your church situation is,
Yeah.
okay, before COVID, you had a church of 3,000 in attendance. Okay, so now what has happened, and what have you done to have a replacement society?
Sure.
Ways to help people grow, get spiritual traction, create that tension that people need to grow spiritually. So what have you done? What are some of the things?
Well, and again, each season of COVID kind of brought, like at the beginning when everybody's hunkering down, everybody was on board. Hey, let's slow the spread kind of thing. Hey, this a month or two, we can figure this out. Right at the beginning, we went straight online, and me and the family every Sunday afternoon, we'd hop in our big church van and we'd drive, like we got a basically social media community kind of together. Anybody who wanted a visit from the pastor could put their name and address down. I mean, we were hitting on every Sunday afternoon, gosh, I want to say 20 to 30 families. We're going to their house, praying with them. We were trying to build community or keep community through just kind of the craziness. And then we could start doing church outside. We moved outside. Again, I looked at a lot of this as an opportunity for innovation to a certain extent. Got a big tent outside that we rented from a company, got all they had left, started building community outside. But again, it's really just, again, the way that I look at it, and I'm a challenge guy. I like challenges because I like to overcome. I like to see what God's going to do with a new set of circumstances. I like that it gives people hope for the future, that it's not, oh my gosh, this is the way it's always going to be. And I like to give hope. So we've done, so many different things, from outdoors to FM transmitters and people watching in their car, to all of the different opportunities. We've done drive-through prayer for people who can't or don't want to get out, but still need that special kind of personal touch. All of our silver saints, as we call them, the older folk, they, a lot of them don't want to come out. And if they do, they don't want much contact. So we did drive-through prayer for several weeks, as they'd come in, roll their window down about this much, and we'd pray for them and just keep them encouraged, keep them apart and in the community. But even as I was kind of coming in with the last part that Brandon was saying, there's a push. And again, I get it. There's that, dichotomy between the follow the government and the, you better open your church up. The problem that I see, and I'm right along with Brandon, is this idea that you're begging for a place to be open, but when you're doing that, you're literally defining you as a building. You're defining like that the church isn't open because the building isn't. It doesn't make any sense, and it's trying to exercise that demon, if you will, that church is defined by buildings. And I mean, Stephen, you've been meeting in a park. I mean, the church is the church, and it's the people. And if there is one thing that has happened through all of this, it is dismantling the idea that the church is a building, or that we need the building in order to be legitimate.
Yeah, it's like, Bonhoeffer said, the church, the challenge before us is the church to get out of the church so it can be the church.
Absolutely.
And we don't like being the church because it's uncomfortable. It doesn't feed our egos. It doesn't stroke our psyches. It doesn't do any of the stuff that we're used to doing. It's the toxicity, that's a word. You know what I meant.
Toxicity, we got you.
Oh, yes, thank you. Of the culture, and it's the drug that we're on, and you don't realize how hard the drug is to kick until how persistent it is to get it out of your system to where you could actually be satisfied with something else.
Right. Absolutely.
I thought
Tell us
Brandon,
how to do that, Bill.
I thought you were going to come in on that.
No, I was waiting for the answer, man. I'm ready for the answer.
Okay. Okay, we've I guess the last part I want, and I'm just trying to think like somebody who's watching this right now or listening to it, is all right. So we're talking about making disciples who make other disciples. Do you think that 2021 has taught you better how to make disciples who make disciples, or do you think you've slowed down making disciples, or do you think have you come to any new like aha moments?
I'll say this. I believe, that, again, as much as I say I like hope, I also am a realist. And I believe even 2020 is a kind of a foreshadowing of what is to come in our nation. And when churches are, and I believe this is sooner than later, and again, not trying to be doom and gloom here, but as churches become labeled probably more and more as a harboring of hate speech and a bastion of a world that needs to be done away with, discipleship, I think, is now even being more defined by what we do outside of this building. And so I think it's actually more of an opportunity for people to understand, like, discipleship needs to take place in these one-on-one settings, less, if you will, in the corporate settings, because that's going to be the future. The future of discipleship is these one-on-one meetings. It is these small groups. It is meeting from house to house, because as the culture continues to decay, you're going to see more and more that this has to be the model, that we have to be reaching people where they're at in the community, in their homes, rather than having this idea that this hub of a building is the place for discipleship. No, you're the place for discipleship, and you've got to continue to do it. So I think it's actually opened people's eyes to the fact that it needs to take place apart from the congregation, if you will, of a building setting.
Yeah, wouldn't it be wonderful we could accomplish this, that the members of our congregations really believe that when they arrive at their office or they arrive at home or their presence, that the kingdom of God has arrived.
That's it.
In them.
Amen.
That would be a spectacular victory.
Amen.
For us. Well, I'm going to have to cut it there. And this is not halftime, guys, so you can't go back to the locker room and have a break right now, because I'm going to include you in this. But right now, we want to talk a little bit about the Bonhoeffer Project. And all of us, Brandon and I from the very beginning, but the other two gentlemen are an integral part of it. And we have over 750 people who have graduated from the Bonhoeffer Project. They are multiplying all over the world, and we are seeing some marvelous things happen in Cameroon, the United Kingdom, Argentina, in India, in other parts of the world. It's growing, but it's growing organically. It's growing through multiplication. And it's about forced soilers, about people whose hearts God has prepared to become disciple-making leaders. We get in cohorts, we spend a year together, and it's we read several books. We spend over 40 hours together in meetings, but then, and this is online, of course, now, we also have the opportunity of working on our projects and our plans. I want to play a couple of videos, first of all, of two pastors who have been a part of us. And when we come back from those videos, we're going to talk some more about the Bonhoeffer Project and what it really is. So let's play those videos right now.
Hey, my name is Dan Houghton, and I'm a church planter about to head to the field to Burlington, Vermont. Next month, we're going to Burlington. We're moving there to plant a church in that area. And I just recently went through the cohort with the Bonhoeffer Project and a couple other guys, and it has been a game changer for us. Being able to go through something like this before we ever step foot on the ground to launch the church has been awesome. And the Bonhoeffer Project is kind of broken down into three different parts: the why, the what, and the how. And I think a lot of times, I know for me anyway, I spend my time on the how, like how are things supposed to get done? And I love that at the very beginning of this, it starts with the question of why. And it makes you kind of question everything that you've learned up until this point in your life in why you present the gospel in the way that you do. And it kind of tears all that down, and then it begins to rebuild the gospel in your own mind according to the Bible. And that has been awesome for me. In knowing that our goal as a church is to plant disciple makers, becoming a disciple maker myself first, and then creating more disciples in that area. And this cohort has been awesome. Some of the projects that we've been able to do in this project with other people. We've got a guy in our group that's from Japan, and he's planted a church in Japan. And to be able to just get together with people that have the same heart and same mind, all for making disciples, has been awesome. It's well worth the cost of this course. I would do it again and pay even more. So if you have the ability to take this course and to become part of a cohort with the Bonhoeffer Project, I would highly recommend it. For us, it's been a game changer, and I know it will be for you.
My name is Earl Mckay. I'm in my 30th year of the pastorate, and I found myself at a stage where I was seeking a program that would help me to finish well. To my amazement, I discovered in plain sight a process through the Bonhoeffer Project that helped me to discover the gospel Jesus preached, the discipleship gospel. We have an amazing court and an amazing facilitator, Denny, who is a true believer, a practitioner who helped me to identify the gospel I've been preaching, the salvation gospel. As a matter of fact, we have a track titled The Plan of Salvation. So I'm excited about this process. I'm excited about this discovery of the gospel Jesus preached and its transformative power, not only of the individual, but what it's all about in terms of transforming this world. And so my church, my leadership team is fully on board. They're excited. It's a process. We've only just begun. And so rather than finding a program that will help me to finish well, what I've found is a new start. And I'm excited. I'm grateful for the Bonhoeffer Project, and I'm committed to share this gospel, this process, with all who come within my sphere of influence. Thank you, Bonhoeffer Project.
It's so refreshing to hear those testimonies. Real life change. in the lives of those men. And what I want to talk about now, just for a moment, is what we actually do in the Bonhoeffer project. And so we'll put that graphic up for you. And the graphic shows 3 boxes. And each box represents basically about a third of the process. The first thing we deal with is why. And the why is the gospel, because we believe the gospel you believe in determines the disciple you make. And that really is then introducing the mind, because transformation, Romans 12:1-2, begins in the mind, transformed by the renewing of your mind. God uses language. God uses these symbols we call language to create the thoughts in us. Christ was the Word of God, the Logos. And so he communicates with us. And as he communicates with us, we begin to understand the gospel. We say that when God saved you, he also called you, that we don't allow this idea to stand in the Bonhoeffer project that conversion is separate from discipleship, that we think they're the same thing. And so when everyone who's called to salvation is called to discipleship, no exceptions, no excuses. So we spend the first couple of meetings, the first 2 months or 3 months, we're talking about the gospel, because what is it? And we talk about the gospel declaration, we talk about the gospel response, and we talk about the gospel benefits. And having a much more holistic discipleship, gospel that includes discipleship as a normal part of what it means to be saved. But then also the next thing is what, because you see, about 95% of people talk about what and how, but only 5% do the why. We start with why. Then we go to what, and that's about a disciple. And this is where specificity is our friend, ambiguity is our enemy. Because if we just say, well, a disciple is someone who follows Jesus, that's true. A disciple is someone who loves Jesus. Yeah, that you can say all these kinds of things, but it's not the right information. The right information is the information I need in order to create a disciple. Now, we understand God alone creates disciples, but you get my meaning. The human instrument, the environment that we live in, the plans that we create, all of this is how we determine what a disciple is. And so that's based upon the gospel, and then that informs what a disciple is. And then we know clearly what we want to create, this disciple. Then comes the plan. That's the how, and that's the habits. And this is where we get into our normal life. In other words, does our plan reflect our gospel that we believe in? Do we have a system or a means or a way in order to create the kind of disciple we want to have? Or do we not? And so this is what we work on for a year. And then it's really essentially a promissory note. It's a plan. You go out into your community, in your area of ministry, and you have a tailor-made plan for you that you've written yourself. And you say, I believe in it, I can do it, and I can change it, and I've been turned into potentially a leader who now can be a disciple maker, because I understand that the gospel I believe in determines the disciple I make, and the disciple I make determines essentially the plan I have. All right, so that's essentially what we do. And while we're doing this, if you have a question, we're going to take questions next, and we want you to be able to ask us these questions, and we'll have our panel of gifted experts share their wisdom with you and try to answer some of these questions. And then, but we want you to know that we're starting in 2021, many different kinds of cohorts are all over the world. And essentially you can go to the bonhoefferproject.com and make application. You can look it over. A lot more than what I've said here is all on the website. Everything I've said here is on the website. Our books are there, videos are there, all kinds of information, plus your application is there. All right. What I would like to do now is to ask our panel, and I'll ask you, Stephen, first. Stephen, in what ways has the Bonhoeffer Project contributed to you becoming, as a leader, a disciple maker?
Yeah, so I think I went through it 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago now, and then been a part of it ever since, and teaching cohorts. And I think I have to remember back, like, what was the biggest thing it did for me? And but I think what it did for me was, among a lot of different things, one of the major things was that it forced me to sit down for 10 months and to work on a plan to make disciples in my context. We planted a church here in Irvine, California. Our mission was already making disciples that make disciples. We knew we wanted to do this, but at the same time, I knew and still know that the tug of a pastor and the tug of a church is away from making disciples. Like, that's always the pull. The pull is to just get numbers or have programs or do all these things. And so for me, the Bonhoeffer Project gave me that opportunity for 10 months to sit in what I believed about disciple making, to learn from the Bonhoeffer Project and all of its collective wisdom about making disciples. And then throughout that 10 months to work together with these other men in my cohort, men and women, and to work on this project that would not just be a silver bullet that someone else had given me, wouldn't be just the latest fad I picked up, but it would be something that I fully believed in, I put my sweat and tears in, and then to be implemented in our church as this kind of living, breathing document that over the years would continue to impact disciple making in our church. And so I think it forced me to sit in it, and it made disciple making, and it made my project, my plan, really become a part of who I am and the DNA of our church. And so I think that's one of the great things it did for me.
My fellow co-founder, Brandon Cook.
Yeah, well, my experience was slightly different because you and I wrote the thing, Bill. Oftentimes we were writing the beta version on our way down to our first meeting. Not that we weren't prepared, but we were just coming up with new ideas. But for me, the impetus to get involved with Bill, and I really asked Bill to mentor me, came out of my recognition as a young pastor that running a church, being the CEO of a church, was going to crush my soul. That I wasn't interested in that, running the show, as I came to call it pretty quickly. Whereas being involved in people's lives and seeing them transform to live and love like Jesus, to live in a new way, that I could sign up for. So I really asked Bill, how do I do that? Help me do this. That was a game changer. That changed everything for me. I would say one of the things I love about Bonhoeffer Project is the fact that we don't sell a silver bullet, because there are no silver bullets. And I've sat through so many people trying to sell me on, just do this will work, you'll grow your church, whatever. What we really do is stand with people in whom God is doing something. We stand with them to see that work to fruition. The other thing that I know that I've had so many conversations with leaders or pastors who know in their being, in their soul, that they want to be about disciple making, but the crush of the show gets in the way of that. And then you end up 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the line, and you haven't done what actually was in your heart to do when you started. So what I love about Bonhoeffer Project is it's actually a space for people to put first things first. It's a commitment of time that is a down payment on saying, I'm going to arrange my life, my ministry, my calling around discipleship first, and let the other pieces fall in place behind that. So it's sort of a sacred, to me, the cohort process is this sacred reordering of priorities that can change everything. And I love that.
Amen.
Okay, Daniel.
Yeah, it's interesting. I come from my context. For those who don't know, I assumed this role, this position as the lead pastor here after our senior pastor had passed away back in 2018. And so when you take over a context versus bringing one up from the ground, you already have a behemoth on your hands. And so to change a culture, it's a little more, it's a taller task in some ways, not in every way. So when I sat down just before the Lord praying, God, what do you want for your church? I mean, apart from as Brandon kind of talked about, the CEO type stuff, what do you want your church to be? And obviously it's very simple when you get into scripture, Jesus's last words were go make disciples of all nations. So I knew that's what I wanted to do, but I really didn't know how to go about that because, again, I think most pastors would agree that they are making disciples. But what I would say that I think they're most likely going to say is they're not sure when they've made one. They're just kind of shooting at the dark and hoping that they're making some, and they might even be surprised when they do make one. They're like, "Well, look, we made one." For me, I wanted it to be intentional, and so even going to the disciple making forum, same thing as Brandon said it, Stephen. You see all of these silver bullets, and again, not to say any of those things aren't good. You do need a curriculum, you do need a process, but I need a process for me. I need a process for my context. Some of those other processes can be part of my process, but what ended up happening is I remember I got to the Bonhoeffer table and they got just one book there, right? There was one book sitting on the table, Conversion to Discipleship. He said, "Oh, is this a curriculum you guys are selling?" And they said, "No." And I said, "Well, what do you got? Where's your bullets? What are you selling?" And they said, "No, we don't sell that." And he kind of pointed to the sign behind him where it says, "The gospel you preach determines the disciple you make." And that was my aha moment, because I realized it was going to the end, going to almost what are we looking to make? And are we going to make it? Well, in order to determine that, you got to go back to the beginning and ask the why questions. And the why questions, that speaks my love language. I am why are we doing what we're doing? I think many churches can get bogged down with processes, get bogged down with traditions. I was just talking with a brother today. He said back at Thanksgiving, his daughter was cutting a ham, and they were always cutting off the ends. And somebody said, "Why do you cut off the ends of the ham?" And I don't know, it's the way my mom always did it. She asked Mom, "Why do you cut off the ends?" The way Grandma always did it. "Grandma, why do you cut off the ends of the ham?" "Oh, we did that when I was a kid because the pot we had was too small. And so we had to cut off the ends of the ham to get it." So it's a tradition that's been carried along for so long, but nobody knows why we're doing it. So for me to answer the why question was deeply rooted. And so the Bonhoeffer Project really afforded me not just to answer the why questions as though it was a quiz on a test or answer on a test and I got it right, but really to know for my own heart why I'm doing what I'm doing. And then to formulate the process around that, to make sure that in my intentionality, that in my definitions, in my communications, that all of it is surrounding the main thing of making disciples. And so for me, that was just it. Once I heard that, I heard Bill speak. He had me at hello, and I appreciated that. It was one of those just moments where I was like, this is the guy who's gone where I want to go. And that made it super simple for me to follow that, because it was all the things that I had expressed in my heart to the Lord, but hadn't had words to it or a methodology to it. And the Bonhoeffer Project gave me that.
Well, these are the kinds of guys that you have as your faculty if you're at all interested in the Bonhoeffer Project. And we want you to go to the website, like I mentioned, and you can fill out the application there. Now, what we're going to do is we are going to answer your questions, and you better have some because that's what we're going to do now. So let's start with the questions, and if let's see if I see any here on chat. Is that it?
No, I'm just going to ask your
Oh,
questions.
you're going to ask the question. Okay.
Just going to ask your questions. Ready?
Yes.
What tools do you use for running a virtual meeting that gives you the ability to run breakout sessions?
All right. Who wants to try that one? You mean like in the Bonhoeffer project? Okay. I think I can answer that. Cindy, why don't you answer that question? You know, actually, I know that you, this is Cindy Perkins, who is our executive director and is not on screen. There she is.
There I am.
Hello, Cindy.
So yes, we use Zoom. Zoom is probably, of all the ones that we've tried, the most stable platform that allows for breakout sessions. And you can have, depending on your level of purchase with Zoom, you can have an unlimited number of breakouts, and it works really, really well. We have a women's ministry that uses that all the time. And we do our small group breakouts into our D groups, our discipleship groups. We do that with the Zoom breakout. So it's really an easy piece. You come in, you say, hey, how are you? And then off you go to your breakout rooms and have your discussions there. So
this might be a great time to mention, we have 3 kinds of cohorts. One is called in person, is that right?
Traditional.
Traditional, yes. I'm afraid that I'm not always up on everything.
That's why he has us.
And then the middle one is called hybrid, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what's that, Cindy?
So the hybrid is a mixture of traditional, like I usually do a hybrid group. We have women only groups that I and some of our other ladies lead, but I usually do a hybrid, which has some people sitting in my living room, but other people on Zoom. But the way we work it is that we're all sitting on Zoom. So it's just like this. We're all in the same room together.
Now I'm going to ask Brandon to describe the virtual, because he is the one who's working on it and doing the beta. So tell us about the virtual, what that's like, Brandon.
Yeah, we're having a blast. We, so much of education is moving online. And so we created, me and Brandon Bathauer, pastor at Saddleback, created this online version of the school, of the cohort process. So that allows people to work at their own speed. They go through all 10 of our projects, of our sessions and our projects. So they get the entire experience. But then, since we're not meeting once a month at a specific time, we have replaced that with coaching, both individual and group coaching. So it's a slightly different dynamic, but you get all the content and you get actually more time with your cohort leader in a certain sense. So we're having a blast doing that. It's a way that we can expand this work around the country, around the globe, and reach more people while retaining sort of the Bonhoeffer secret sauce.
Amen.
Yeah. And Brandon, both our Brandons have done a great job on that. Okay, let's, other questions.
Next question. Realistically, how long does it take to redesign and transition a Western church to become a natural disciple-making church? And at the church family level, what are a couple of first steps in the process we should take?
Okay, I'm going to throw the first part of that question to Brandon Cook, and then let Dan answer the second part.
Oh, so I'm taking how long does it take?
Yeah.
Well,
you had several years as a pastor.
I think to get the basic change in place, you're talking probably about a 3 or 5 year process in terms of changing the direction of the ship. Obviously, that's a huge generalization based on the nature of your context. But there's things that can be done immediately that Dan will talk about. I don't mean to steal your thunder, Dan, but the thing that came to mind.
It's okay.
The thing that came to mind for me is language. Is that it starts with language. Language creates reality. And so I had a mentor tell me, like what we do in Bonhoeffer Project is we start with the gospel. Many people think they understand what the gospel is. And it may sound something like, well, you get converted to Jesus, you pray a prayer, you're going to go to heaven when you die, and now try to follow him. And that's the extent of their gospel. What we do in Bonhoeffer is we really get into the robustness of a Jesus-focused, kingdom-centered gospel in which we live in allegiance to Jesus in all things in order that the kingdom of God can be made manifest around us. That's my languaging, but I think that gets close to it. Changing your language around the gospel can change culture, but you're going to have to, people aren't going to necessarily pick up on that right away. I had a mentor tell me, you're going to have to you're going to have to say the vision so many times that you're just about to throw up, and about the point where you're sick because you've said it so many times. That's just about the point that some people will say, oh, okay, I'm getting this. In other words, we're talking, there's things that can be done overnight, but we're not talking about an overnight process. And therefore, committing to be a disciple-making leader, changing a church culture is often not for the faint of heart. It takes courage, which is why we don't just focus on the what and the why and the how. We also focus on the who. What is God shaping in you as you're becoming the person you've been called to be? Because it's going to be that actually leads, that carries the movement. And it's going to take a concerted effort. So to answer, my basic answer, generalized answer to that question would be, well, you're looking at least 18 months to 3 years of concerted effort to establish the basics of a disciple-making culture. And beyond that, you're talking about a lifelong journey, because we never arrive. That's part of the joy of this, is there is no arrival point. There's just continual learning.
Yeah, I would say on a practical side, first thing you got to do is get your leadership on board. Depending on if you what your leadership style is and kind of what the church context that you're in, whether you've got a board of elders, directors, co-pastors, things like that, you've got to sell them on this idea. And it should be a pretty easy sell because it's scripture. So making disciples, it should be, right? The problem becomes when ministries get in the weeds, and you end up creating so many ministries and offshoots and tangents that the purpose of discipleship doesn't get made. One of the things that I did on a very practical note, I used the words discipleship, mentoring, one-on-one, and accountability. And I said, I want my whole staff, define these words. And out of the entire staff, guess what? Every single one had a different definition. And what that did was demonstrate how important words are, how important messaging is, how important it is to know what we mean when we say it. Because it's so funny, because we end up talking to each other using the same words, but we couldn't be further apart in the context of what we're actually trying to convey. So we end up saying, yeah, well, we are making disciples. Well, that's different, because what you mean when you say disciple is different what I mean when I say making disciples. And so that messaging has to be very clear. So going to your leadership, elder team, board, whatever it may be in your context, and saying, hey, what is a disciple? And just asking them what that is, define it. Because you're going to find they're all going to have a different understanding of it. Or as Bill even talked about a little before, general, somebody who follows Jesus, somebody who loves Jesus. I even love how, even part of the Bonhoeffer project, we get into really the nuances of what that is, disciple making, and just to hit it home so that it is defined well in whatever context you're in.
Yeah, just to understand the difference between the word disciple, discipleship, disciple making, the word evangelism, what do these words mean, and how do they interact?
Well, and like one in particular, just a simple method, I kind of, and again, I didn't outlaw it. It's not legalism, but in our church, I said, listen, for all your leadership, all of our printed material, all of our communication, don't use the word Christian anymore. Use the word disciple, because it changes the language. If somebody comes up to you on the street and says, hey, are you a Christian? You say, well, I'm more of a disciple of Christ. Instantly, that's going to create a differentiation between the 70% of Americans who say they're Christian and those who say, well, I'm a little different than that. It's a little more nuanced. Let me explain why.
Okay, next question.
Next question. Each of you have gone through the program as lead pastors to begin a discipleship focus within your churches. But how would you recommend a layperson approach their lead pastor for support in starting a program within their church? I assume it might be a grassroots effort that would ideally ultimately lead to the broader gospel focus change in the church itself.
Well, I think that Stephen, why don't you give that a go, but I think Cindy should do that too, because Cindy really lives it out, lives that out every day.
So I'll be the warm up for you, Cindy. Okay. Yeah. So that's a tough position. Bill, I'll go back to what I've heard you say a lot. I've heard you say, don't announce the revolution, just start it. Right. And, I think the answer is kind of in the question. You said it was a grassroots thing, and I think that's true. And even in our church, and thinking about some of the components of our plan that we implemented, I know the tendency is always to think, especially as a pastor or a leader, like I want everybody to experience this program or this whatever. And usually when it starts with everybody, it just doesn't last. And so, with us, we started it on a very small scale with a very small group of people that I personally discipled for about a year. And so that would be my recommendation. Whatever it is, as you go through this process, whatever form of system or discipleship that you fall on, to hand select a small group of people and let it start with them. That's the Jesus model, and it worked out pretty well for him, and it multiplied from there. So that would be my suggestion.
That's exactly how it is. I actually started this process in my local church when I started the Bonhoeffer Project, and I had been discipling a few of our ladies, and that's how it began. As I just came alongside them and started walking with them. I then found Bill and Brandon in the Bonhoeffer Project and realized that I could lead up in this place. I could lead into that because it is a grassroots movement. I would tell you that the number one thing that you do before you ever go and talk to your senior leadership is pray, and pray some more, because it's a process that we have to embody and embrace first. And so it's a lead by example, honestly. It's here we go. I'm going to walk with these ladies for a year, and now you're going to see the fruit and the evidence in their lives. And when you see the fruit and the evidence in their lives, then maybe we could do that on a broader scale. And so they actually created a position leading the discipleship space for me after I had done that for a while. And most recently, our senior pastor just graduated from a cohort with Bill. So it can be done. It has to be done with respect. It has to be done with love and care, because you don't want it to feel like you're adversarial. That's a really key piece, because you may see this so very clearly that you want everybody in your world to experience this, but maybe it's not God's time. And that's the hardest thing to learn as you're sitting in that place and you see it and you're chomping at the bit to go, is wait for God's time, because when God's time was right, he stepped into a cohort. But that was several years after I had been doing discipleship on the grassroots level. And so I'm a firm believer in bloom where you're planted. God placed you where you are for a very specific reason, and with the people that you're with. And he may not have given you the opportunity to be the senior leader and the decision maker, but that does not absolve you from the responsibility given to us by Christ, commanded to us by Christ, to make disciples. And so you just do it, and then you pray, and then you have conversations, take your pastor to lunch and say, hey, I'd like to talk to you about something. And say, have you ever thought about, and then off you go. Always lead with a question. That's what Jesus did. So that's what I do. Lead with a question.
Do we have any more questions?
We do not have any more questions at this point.
Well.
Oh, wait, one's coming.
One's coming in. Okay. What time is it over? Oh.
How do pastors or leaders' spouses interface with the cohort process?
Well, I think anybody want to try that one? How their spouses interface with it? Do our spouses even know what we're due? I mean, if you said Bonhoeffer Project at your house, Dan, would anybody would there be any response from your wife?
Yeah, my wife would say, "Oh, is it Thursday again?" And I'd say, "Yeah, it's Thursday again." No, but it's really as much as you want to let them in. Because that last question too, the way it was phrased was, a program. If you think of the Bonhoeffer Project in terms of a program, it's going to be something that will eventually die. All programs come to an end. Discipleship is a movement. It is a methodology. It is a philosophy within Jesus's construct and how he created us. And so even within that, it's a lifestyle. So if my wife isn't on board with the lifestyle of making disciples, I'm either doing a bad job as a leader or a husband, or I need to find another line of work. My job is to make disciples. And it's almost in that same context that Cindy was, I want to respect my wife enough in her time. She homeschools 4 kids. There's a lot that she's got going on, but she's going to see the fruit in me, and it's going to be contagious. And I want to disciple her. I mean, that's part of, what Ephesians tells us about loving our wives. But spouses, I mean, they should be involved in it as much as you'll let them be involved in them. Telling them about everything that's going on and giving them all of the nuances that you're learning. And it's infectious. I'll tell you that. It's absolutely infectious.
Now, Cindy, isn't it true that some people in our cohorts, there's actually been married people go through it together. We do have where the spouses are going through separate ones, don't we?
We do. We've had, we actually have one that he just finished up, and she is in a women's cohort because she specifically wanted to go through with women. We have a couple in Texas that he's in Sandy's cohort, and she's in Carmelita's cohort. So we also have Tony and Joy Waller stepping in, and they have a desire to see couples who partner in ministry together to go through the project together. So I'm really excited about that. We're going to be launching that later on in the spring, probably early spring, so that couples who minister together, because there are couples who really do ministry in that same space. But yeah, we've had all kinds of scenarios with couples happening in that space.
One of the things you can do is you go to our website and you move around a little bit. You'll find our faculty. You will find that some of the people that Cindy just mentioned, their names and where they are in the country. We also have representatives. We have quite a few people. I don't know if there might be as many as 50 people who are on our faculty in one way or the other, and that's expanding, and that's just domestically. We're not talking about the other parts of the world. When you start having faculty that you've never met personally, you're being successful, because that means that it's multiplying and you can't keep up with it. You can't control it necessarily. And that's all very good, actually, in so many ways. Anything else, Cindy, that we need to do? I know we have one more thing to do, and that is that we would like for you to go to the website and make application. We can't talk to you. We can't interact with you. We can't help you discern what God wants you to do if we can't talk to you. So if you sign up, we'll contact you. We'll have a conversation with you. And yes.
So yes.
There should be something coming up on the screen. Is that correct?
Do know that if you put in a request for information, I'm the person who will call you, and we'll have a conversation. Know where we are. This is a pretty good question. One last question says, it's great that we're influencing existing leaders in churches. Is there an opportunity at all to influence change, or at least influence a discipleship curriculum option at seminaries?
Well, I guess I could take a stab at that. I think that seminaries do a really good job with academics. They try really hard at practical sides of things with institutes and seminars and so on. But the problem is that they are not set up to help you deal with some of the same things we do, but we have some kind of inroads to certain seminaries where we either we are faculty members, like I'm a faculty member at Talbot School of Theology in the Los Angeles area at Biola University, and I teach in the doctoral program, and that's part of the discipleship program. And several of our people do some instructing in there or in other places, or in the college level like Cindy does as a professor. But I would say that that's not the main thing we do, but there's good courses on discipleship in doctoral classes in particular, but they're primarily reading a lot of books, reading 4,000 words and doing and writing papers and so on. And it's good on the upstream, but not so strong on the mid or downstream. That would be my, 30,000 foot assessment.
All right, that's our last question.
Okay, that's the last question. We want to thank all of you for hanging in there with us. I want to thank our panel. You guys did a great job today, spectacular, as I prophesied beforehand. And that's my best prophetic move I have this year. And we hope that you will become part of us, pray for us, visit our website. And so I want to thank Stephen Kimbrell, Brandon Cook, Dan Lights, and of course, Cindy Perkins. So God bless you.
Thanks, Bill.